name's Susan Healy, and I'm the outreach coordinator for Windham World Affairs, and I really want to extend a heartfelt welcome to all of you, and especially to those who have recently renewed your membership. It's been a while since we got that part organized, and your support enables us to produce these events and offer them free to the public. And a number of you who have renewed, because you saw it on our newsletter, that we are offering now, it's a special. So if you renew now at the old rate, that is going to give you 18 months of membership at the old rate, because our rates are going to go up July 1st. So there's still time to do that. This is going to be our final speaker event of the summer. We're going to take the summer off. We have a lot that we're planning for the fall, but before we go, there is one more event this Wednesday, our America 250 event that we are in partnership with Brooks Memorial Library, Vermont Independent Media, and the Vermont Humanities. We have these regular planning sessions for America 250, and this Wednesday at the library at 6 p.m., we're going to be hosting Brianna Sheehan, an Elnu Abenaki appointed by Governor Scott to represent Vermont's state-recognized tribes on the Vermont 250th Anniversary Commission. She's a graduate of Brattleboro Union High School and Dartmouth College. She now serves as the administrative director of the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, and she'll share her perspective on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and join us in a discussion about how Brattleboro can contribute to this important commemoration. These monthly America 250 gatherings every fourth Wednesday at the library are designed to foster connection, collaboration, and action aligned with the Commission's mission, which is to inspire all Vermonters to learn from history, legacy, and context of the past to build strong Vermont communities in the future. So while we're on break, we'd still like you to think about getting more involved. If you are interested in perhaps becoming a board member, please reach out to one of us here tonight or sometime over the summer. We have two chair people. Scott, the pastor and teacher here at Center Congregational, is co-chair with Merrill Sovner. Tamara stepped down from being chair and is now our treasurer. And Claire Gillis is here also, a chair member. She welcomed you as you came in, and she is currently writing our press releases. If you have any ideas for an event in the future, please run that by us. If you're interested in writing an article for our blog, we'd love to hear that. That is open to you. So we will resume the Blowback series this fall, which is our America 250 contribution, and it is about continuing the exploration of how U.S. foreign policy, particularly during times of military intervention and regime change, has contributed to global instability, migration, and long-term resentment. Fortunately, that's not just history we'll be reviewing. So since 1961, Windham World Affairs Council has brought global issues to this community. We are the smallest chapter of a national organization, and it was co-founded. Many of you know that, but we have a lot of new people here tonight. It was co-founded by John Kenneth Galbraith, and in the fall, we will be having our annual Galbraith lecture. We were very, very excited for the past year, thinking that his mentee, Robert Wright, was going to be the speaker, but then the world changed. And he became much busier than he was when a year ago he told us he could possibly be here. But right now we are exploring some other exciting speakers, and we look forward to being able to announce that soon. In these turbulent times, we believe our work and your support is even more important than it's been in a long, long time. So again, we are really grateful for you to be here. Chuck Collins, in a moment, is going to introduce David Bollier, and we want to remind you, you see Annie Zimmerman in the corner from Everyone's Books, and she has a copy of David's second edition of Think Like a Commoner. And after you hear him, I'm pretty confident you're going to want to buy that book. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Chuck, who will introduce David.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for the way you are the glue and organizing this. I'm curious how many of you saw the movie Invisible Doctrine when it was at the Latches? Some of you. It was a documentary about neoliberalism and the whole idea of the kind of the encroachment of the market into every element of human life and human existence. And in that documentary, and George Monbiot in the book version as well, talks about, well, what's the counterweight to that? And he talks about the commons and the importance and the power of the commons. And so what is the counterweight? Well, people say, well, neoliberalism, is it socialism? Well, actually, in the case of the commons, we can have a robust, healthy commons and a private market operating alongside it, but the commons is recognized and defended and protected in a way that doesn't allow for the extraction that we saw in that discussion of neoliberalism. So tonight we're going to talk about this concept of the commons. And you may have heard the phrase social wealth or commonwealth, or this idea of what is it that we hold together, what is it we maybe own together, but isn't privately owned or shouldn't be privately owned, shouldn't be owned by corporations. And the easiest is obviously to think of the gifts of nature, the ecological commons, water, seeds, the air, soil, minerals. It's clear to understand, like, we didn't create these things, humans didn't create these things, and our mission should be to pass them on undiminished to future generations. But the commons can also be what we create together. Human creations like the internet or knowledge, language, all those are a form of commons. And we ourselves in this community, you can kind of walk out the door, if you think about it. If you walk out this door and turn right, you're at the Brattleboro Commons. You pass the Brooks Library, which is a commons. You pass the post office, which is a civic institution, in this case owned by government, but government can be a holder of commonwealth or the commons. We have the Aiken Center next door, right? It's a vibrant health center, community center for seniors. We can go across the street and pick up the Commons, our local newspaper. And in fact, thanks to Annie Lamberger for writing that terrific article and interview with David in the most recent issue of the Commons. So we are surrounded by the Commons. And the nonprofit sector in our community is so vibrant and does so much of the important work in holding commons and commons institutions. I don't know about you, but today, for some reason, I was thinking about hot yoga. Anybody ever done hot yoga? Yeah, so there's this, and there was a couple of years ago, there was a guy, Bikram Chowdhury, who started Bikram Yoga. And he, at one point, he says, well, I have these schools and I train these teachers, and then these teachers go on and they open a yoga studio. And he got a little bit upset that some of the people who weren't giving him credit. So he said, well, I'm going to patent my form of yoga. And so he went out to seek intellectual property rights to own yoga. Now think about it. Who owns yoga? I mean, 5,000-year-old tradition. Who owns most traditional indigenous knowledge? Well, we see that encroachment all the time, that attempt to take what is in the commons and put it in somebody's pocket. And that was kind of like, reminded me when, can you really patent yoga? Turns out you can patent dance steps. So you could patent a sequence of yoga moves. So a friend of mine said, well, the key to understanding the commons, the first step is to see it, is to literally be able to see all the ways the commons shows up in our lives. See it, name it. So by giving it a name, we're saying, well, this is real. The Windham World Affairs Council is a commons. It's a conversation commons. It's a, who owns it? It is us together. We're members. We're holding it together. See it, name it, claim it, and in some cases that might mean giving it stewardship or protection or ownership rights, boundaries. That's a form of thinking about it. And defend it. Defend it against looting, plunder, extraction, taking. That's our mission. And the start is to think like a commoner, to see this together. So I'm thrilled to introduce David Bollier, who is really a global public scholar on the commons. He doesn't live that far away, lives in Amherst, but he is in Brattleboro. He's in Amsterdam or somewhere else more than he is in other parts of the world. He is connected to a whole global commons movement. And again, we are asking, well, we're the Windham World Affairs Council. Certain countries, certain cultures, certain traditions have a much clearer understanding of this notion of the commons. They may have a different set of words to describe it, but in fact, through human history, people's understanding of the commons is much more advanced than what we today don't understand. And I remember, actually digging through my books, I found a book that David wrote in 2002 called Silent Theft, The Private Plunder of Our Commonwealth. And I remember exactly where I was when I was reading it. I was in Mexico, and I was in a little hotel room, and my family's sleeping, and I'm reading this book with a flashlight, and just my mind was being blown. And I went back and found it has all these passages underlined and everything. So even before I met David Bollier, I was reading his work and his thinking about the commons and the Commonwealth. And we worked together on a kind of a research group that was looking at the commons and how to promote the commons. His current work and role is he's the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economy, which is down in Great Barrington. His newest book, Think Like a Commoner, as Susan said, Anne and everyone's books is selling it. Think about if there's somebody who, when you hear this talk, who wasn't able to come, who has a birthday coming up or an event, and you can give them a copy, an autographed copy of Think Like a Commoner. But let's give David Bollier a Windham County welcome, and for his historic work.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Chuck. Chuck and I worked together for briefly, maybe 10 years ago. I lose track as I get older of how long ago, but we were fellow travelers in exploring and developing the commons. And I mean, it's always a thrill to connect with other people who get the commons. This book was started, actually, I could say 40 or 50 years ago when I worked for Ralph Nader, when much of my work was, we didn't have the vocabulary then, it was about fighting enclosures of the commons, meaning the privatization and commodification of our shared wealth. And it wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s that I connected with other proto-commoners who precisely understood what it was all about. This book itself had its origin about a year and a half ago when some people in Thailand said, well, we'd like to do a translation of your book. This was originally published in 2014. And I said, oh, that's great. And then I went back and started to read it, and I said, ooh, this is a little stale. There's so much that's happened since I wrote it in 2012, 2013. And so that led to the book coming out this March, and I've been out having conversations about it ever since. So what I'd like to do is give you probably a condensed but very comprehensive overview of the commons that will raise probably more questions than answer, but will give you an idea of the scope and texture and complexity of the commons. And so that's my chief goal. When I first wrote this second edition, which was a substantial rewrite of the original edition, I didn't realize the context that we would have and how in some ways it's become more relevant. And so let me just open by reminding everyone of the stage that we're in. I start from the proposition that neoliberal capitalism has hollowed out the state, while of course doing the things that it's always done, which is extract and privatizing value, externalizing these costs onto other people, a competitive race to the bottom that's making us all more impoverished, you might say, more immiserated, and commodifying every nook and cranny of life. We've seen how global supply chains are fragile, costly, and ecologically harmful because of the amount of carbon that they entail in servicing global capitalism. And we saw how the pandemic confirmed just how really unfair the market system really is when push comes to shove, and who bears the brunt of the costs. And meanwhile, of course, the capitalist economy is burning our planet. And this has a lot to do with the imperatives of our growth economy. And I've come to the conclusion that the market state narratives, and I say market state because the state is utterly complicit in this whole project, they're no longer a credible narrative for the future. I think they're just artifacts of another time. And yet, our political debate is kind of outdated and without a long-term focus. It often focuses on capitalism versus socialism, and I'm, of course, very friendly to socialism, but I think that the world has changed too, and the kind of centralized control and the technological progress, quote, and the growth that even socialism entailed is not really right for our moment. And in the internet period, where we have all sorts of bottom-up participatory creativity, socialism is not quite the answer, at least as historically enacted. So my proposition is we need to expand our imaginations. I love this quote from a book by the Greek fellow, Demetrius Papadopoulos. What if we approach social movement action not as targeting existing political power, but as experimenting with worlds? In other words, creating new worlds, and not being immured within ideology or electoral systems, but being able to think in new directions. And my proposition is that commoning is a creative experimental practice that can help us imagine and build a new world outside of conventional capitalist-driven markets and state power. And let me just, before I get into the meat of what I want to say there's a little bit of history we have to deal with. Because historically, the commons has been invisible and neglected and misunderstood. The market and state are seen as the only serious systems of power and governance and getting stuff done. And the commons is sort of seen as this medieval artifact that, it's kind of interesting, it's curious, but it's not really relevant. And that idea has been reinforced quite perniciously by the whole tragedy of the commons parable that most of you have heard of. This is drilled into every undergraduate, whether you're in political science or sociology or economics, that if you have a pasture, nobody will have the incentive to hold back, and you will rationally take as much as you can for yourself, leading to the overexploitation and ruination of the shared pasture. But this Garrett Hardin was the author of that famous 1968 article in Science Journal. But as Lewis Hyde, another scholar of the commons, has pointed out, there's all sorts of political and ideological assumptions built into this parable. It's really the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. That's his presumption of what humanity is all about, that you grab for all you can, screw your neighbors, and of course, that's really, ironically enough, not what a commons is about, because a commons is a bounded community that has its own rules, that punishes people who violate those rules. And in some ways, what's so ironic is that he was describing the tragedy of the market, which is an open access free-for-all, grab as much as you can. And he was continuing a tradition that has been perpetuated by standard economics and capitalists, that the commons is, as John Locke put it, a wasteland, res nullius. There's nothing there. And because value is only created by the market, by market exchange, and the commons is really just worthless. And this has been the rationale. I might say that John Locke's philosophy of value in land, that if you develop it, you're entitled to own it, has been the basis for so much colonial and neo-colonial plunder. In our time right now, there's a land grab going on internationally that parallels what happened 200-300 years ago with the original colonial movements. Latin America, Asia, Africa, governments are colluding with investors, sovereign investment funds, to privatize land for investors. Roughly 20% of the human genome is now privately owned through patents, which of course inhibits the kind of research people might do lest you step on someone's patent or get sued for violating it. There's actually mathematics that's privately owned in the form of algorithms. You can patent algorithms, and what you might think is sort of pure knowledge that anybody can access is privately owned. McDonald's has gone after people who named their restaurants McDarmas, for example, and they're very jealous of claiming to own Mick through trademark law. And one of my favorites was how singing around the campfire was considered a public performance requiring a copyright license from the music licensing body ASCAP years ago. They backed off when there was a huge uproar, but nonetheless it showed they had the legal right to do that. It's just they backed off for publicity reasons. They wanted summer camps to pay roughly $1,000 to sing copyrighted songs, Puff the Magic Dragon, and so forth. Now, I could say much more about enclosures, and in fact, my first book, as Chuck mentioned, was about the multitude of enclosures that I consider the great unacknowledged scandal of our times, because all of that is characterized as progress, growth, human betterment. And of course, markets often do have those effects, but in the aggregate, in the aggressive way that capitalism does it, it often creates a lot of ILF, as John Ruskin said, a lot of those negative side effects that, of course, are off the books, and somebody else, like government or individuals, need to suffer from. And the commons really didn't get rescued, at least philosophically and intellectually, until Professor Eleanor Ostrom from the Indiana University, her life's work was studying the commons in a very empirical way with lots of field work in mostly global south natural resource context, water, forests, fisheries, farmland, wild game, many other things. And she wanted to understand how they worked and why cooperation could be economically consequential, something that standard economics more or less ignores. And she wrote Governing the Commons, a 1990 book that became a classic. and she won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work, improbably. My own pet theory is that after the 2008 financial crisis, they wanted somebody a little nicer and more humane than was around, and they chose her. She was entirely merited it, but many in the profession didn't know her, and since her winning the award, they've mostly ignored her. She died in 2012, and there still remains a very robust international body of scholars who study her work. In fact, I was at their every 2-year conference last week at UMass Amherst, which they hold in different continents every 2 years. And so it still remains a robust tradition, but mainstream economics, despite her Nobel Prize recognition, has not really wanted to incorporate her insights into things. But I was greatly influenced by her work in the late 90s as I became disaffected with a lot of the directions of things and came to see that, as I will now move into the section, that commons are no tragedy. They're actually exceedingly generative and growing, and they take many different forms. And I'm going to give you a quick tour of what I call the commons verse to give you a sense of how diverse, varied, and extremely productive they are. And for me, the key question is, how can we begin to understand the commons as a social form offering possibilities beyond those of the capitalist market state? So my brief tour of the commons starts with land, which is a timeless tradition to manage land as a commons. The idea of private ownership, let alone industrial farming, is anathema because, of course, it's not really responsible stewardship of land. It's grab and go, rip and run. It's not genuine stewardship. Despite this, there is around the world an estimated 2 billion people who are subsistence commoners, meaning they're not involved in the market, they're growing for their families or their communities with minimal market engagement, which means some of that is poverty, but some of it is simply for the household. Traditional indigenous communities for all these different types of commons are far more pervasive than is recognized, but economics doesn't really find it interesting because there's no money changing hands, or very little money changing hands, and they regard it as pre-modern, in need of development, quote. And yet, it's arguably a far more stable, ecologically benign form of meeting people's needs. But this isn't just in the global south. Global food sovereignty is popping up all over in Europe and North America as well, in all these different forms. They're not necessarily coordinated, they have different traditions or ways of approaching it, but they're trying to relocalize food, agriculture and food distribution, and to do it in ways that are more, let's just say, mutually beneficial than markets, which are about maximizing private profit. There's a movement right now in Europe and many other countries to develop the city as a commons. A lot of residents in cities like Barcelona, Amsterdam, and a lot of provincial cities in Italy and France don't want rich investors or developers taking over their city and dictating how the city is going to be run. There's a big movement in some cities protesting Airbnb, for example, for hollowing out neighborhoods by renting it out to tourists and destabilizing their towns. So there's attempts to reimagine how people can participate in conjunction with municipal governments to engage in commoning for all sorts of different purposes. It's still at a very experimental stage. There's no standard typology for how it is, but it's a very robust and happening thing. But even outside of major cities like that, there's lots of types of local commons. This is a mural from a solar commons project in Minnesota, where they have solar arrays that are owned by a community land trust, a community trust. The money is sold to the grid, but the money is distributed for various community purposes by that trust. So it's an attempt to use something that belongs to us anyways, the sun and its energy, and use it for collective purposes, but many other types of commons as well. All of these are characterized really by bottom-up participation and involvement for mutual benefit, and not necessarily top-down service providing. So it has a different character. There's a lot of local currencies that are recirculating community value. The Schumacher Center in Western Massachusetts oversees the circulation of the Berkshires, which is a complementary currency that has quite extensive circulation in Western Mass. It's a way for value to be captured by the community and instead of being siphoned off to the major financial centers. And ultimately, the goal is to have lending via those alternative currencies. But there's also neighborhood currencies in Africa, mutual credit systems in Berlin, fair coin is in Catalonia. So there's a lot of experiments going on, some more developed than others, but filled with great promise. In the digital world, the Creative Commons licenses have been a significant contribution to making content, whether it's music or film or written word books, scholarship, make it legally shareable. If you're the copyright owner, you can take a Creative Commons license and essentially signal this work can be used without permission or payment for free in perpetuity. And this has been a really important legal tool for people to be able to share their works, because otherwise things are born as private property through copyright law. So this has had significant ramifications. It built on the open source software revolution. This is the penguin is the symbol and logo for Linux, the open source software system. Whoops, I don't know how the words got on there, but LibreOffice is the equivalent, the open source equivalent of word processing, or Microsoft Word. That's the symbol for the green circle for open access scholarly publishing, which people can use for free. Free software, Apache, which is a software that's in the back end of the internet that's very important to its usage. So there's just a huge explosion of open source software which is modifiable at will and cannot be taken private. A very significant development, not only legally, but in terms of culturally. The very idea of something being open source means participatory, copyable, you can improve on it as you wish, and it's kind of a cultural norm, you might say. And it's given rise to a whole second generation of open source innovation called cosmo-local production. And this is where design and knowledge are shared on the internet through global communities, and then people produce physical stuff locally. And there's agricultural farm equipment. There's Arduino, which are electronic circuit boards, all that can be copied. It's trademarked, meaning that it's identified by the trademark, but anybody can copy it. Fab labs and makerspaces are a lot of important incubators for this kind of innovation. One of my favorites is the parents of people with diabetes who had tech backgrounds got together and created a do-it-yourself insulin delivery pump connected to an iPhone app, because the medical device industry didn't regard that as profitable enough, or it was too risky. Whatever, they had to do it themselves. And it's a rather remarkable technical achievement, but it shows that all sorts of commons can pop up in the most unlikely space. In fact, I think it's important to realize there's no master inventory of commons. They can pop up anywhere. There's a National Theater Commons of nonprofit and community theater in Boston that's national in scope called HowlRound. There's these techies who create street maps to deal with natural disasters, earthquakes or tornadoes, where they instantly create digital maps showing here's where the hospitals are, here's where the waters are, and they facilitate first responder rescue. Potato Park in Peru, indigenous people protect their genetically special diversity of dozens of different types of potatoes, which a lot of ag biotech companies wanted to capture to patent for their genetic background. In Catalonia, they have a massive Wi-Fi network that is run as a commons that has better quality than we have here at less cost. It's an example of how if commoners own the equity of their shared resources, they can provide it more cheaply without all the negative social and ecological consequences. And there's a lot of people that, inspired by open source, have created a seed initiative because with the rise of ag biotech companies patenting a lot of their proprietary seeds, farmers can't even share seeds. And so they wanted to make certain seeds legally shareable and unable to be taken private by corporations. So what does all this about the commons versus reveal? Well, for me, that it's feasible to build coherent, effective, responsible, bottom-up social forms of meeting needs and self-governance. And now, a lot of people think about commons as resources, and that's maybe the standard economics way or political way of talking about them. The oceans is a commons, the internet is a commons. I like to take a more nuanced approach to say that really commons have to be understood as living social organisms, because the internet or the oceans don't manage themselves. They're simply a common pool resource, as the scholars put it. They're not a commons that self-govern themselves. They need people to do that. So once you open this door, you start to find a lot of explanatory answers. That it's not a resource, it's a peer organized social system. And it consists of a community and a resource, I'll circle back to that in a minute, as well as the social norms and practices and traditions and culture and ethic and other ways that you maintain your community and govern your community. And I crossed out resource because resource implies it's just inert, it's a commodity, I can sell it, it's not have little to do with me. But commoners love their resources. It's part of their culture, it's often part of their identity. If you talk to indigenous people, their lives are profoundly affected by their landscape or that river or that mountain, or they regard it as sacred. So I prefer to call it care wealth because in many instances, commoners have a very special relationship to their resource. And this gets to the point that in a commons, relationality is primary over the quote resource, the object. And you have to learn to see the relationality. Fortunately, if you look at history, you'll see that cooperation is this proven way of humans evolving. And we see it through language and art and many other things that have made the human species the human species. Interestingly, there's a lot of other disciplines that are focusing on relationality as the core story. You can see it in biology, where you've undoubtedly seen all the books about mycelia and ecosystems, and there's a whole spate of indigenous culture books coming out these days. They focus on this relationality. Quantum physics, certain elements of economics, cultural studies are all focusing on relationality as opposed to individuals and objects. It's a really interesting shift. I think it's nicely summed up by Thomas Berry, this cultural historian and religious scholar, who said, the universe is the communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And I think that goes to the quick of what we're talking about here, which of course poses a rather profound challenge to the assumptions of standard economics. Another quote in this regard that I think gets to the nub of it is Andreas Weber, an eco-philosopher in Germany, says, science and economics are unwilling to acknowledge creative aliveness as an ontological foundation of reality. Ontology being the nature of being, the nature of existence. And he's a theoretical biologist as well as an eco-philosopher, and he points out that this creative aliveness is something that biologists can't begin to get their minds around. They're still stuck in the machine metaphors, the Newtonian view of the universe. And yet, as I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of books coming out If you haven't read Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, it's a mind blower of what science is showing about the entanglement of different forms of life with each other and how this is critical to life's vitality, and how our human biome, we're made up, much of our bodies is made up of things that are not us, you might say, bacteria and so forth. It raises questions of what life is, but I think the commons goes to that space. The point is, there's this intersubjectivity that is at the core of the commons, and it's all symbiotic. We're in a constant relationship with other forms of life in our life, whether it's an ecosystem, whether it's our biome, whether it's each other, whether it's other species. Which leads me to a rather maybe radical proposition that commoning is really about world making. It's not just another economic management form. It's a space that gives rise to meaning and belonging and wholeness. And this is, George Monbiot has a great quote in one of his columns about this, that this is about belonging. It's a way of social reparation through reconnection with each other. But of course, just to make sure the contrast is appreciated, standard economics has different priorities. It regards the individual as utterly sovereign, which of course is biologically absurd. It regards value as equivalent to market price. It sees progress as fulfilled through economic growth, and governance by capital, state, hierarchies, and experts as the way we keep this whole system properly managed. And I'd like to immodestly propose that there's a different theory of value that the Commons proposes, which is living systems are generative. And we can see this in the various examples that I have cited here, where when living entities get together, without trucking and bartering in the marketplace or market exchange, there's a certain symbiotic creativity that emerges when they get together. And I think that this is what animates the commons, this is what stabilizes the commons, this is what makes it work. And my former and now late colleague, Silke Helfrich, and I wanted to, after working together for 15 years, understand this better. We wanted to know what the inner dynamics of a commons was all about. Standard economics has homo economicus, rational, utility maximizing, materialistic individuals. What's going on in the commons? We wrote this book it was published in 2019 to try to answer that question. And we realized that we needed to reconceive the commons not as a noun, but as a verb. It's an activity, it's not a thing. It's a set of relationships. And we realized, to our dismay, that this requires an ontological shift, a shift of worldview, a shift of what we think human beings are and how they exist in the world. Neither of us were professional philosophers, but we realized that it went this deeply. And so we were calling for a so-called onto shift, because that's the only way you can begin to see the relationality that lies at the heart of the commons. And to try to do this, we developed what we called patterns of commoning. We identified certain recurrent behaviors that we saw across the board, whether it's a forest commons, a digital commons, an urban commons, a social service commons. There are certain recurrent challenges and dilemmas that commoners face. And I don't have time to get into all of these, of course, but I will, I just say that there's three major areas in social life, provisioning, and peer governance. And those are three major areas, all interconnected, that have to be dealt with. And the patterns are very concrete, such as contribute freely, ritualized togetherness, trust situated knowing. These are ways that people can begin to assess how well their commons may be working. It's not as if all the patterns are present in all commons, but they happen enough that they're touchstones or guidelines for considering it. And to help advance this idea, we recently created these cards similar to, you might say, tarot cards, in which there's an image on one, the pattern on another, a brief description of the pattern, and some examples. And it's a way for people's organizations to self-assess, for them to assess how are we doing as commoners? How are we commoning? One is bring diversity into shared purpose, a very serious challenge for many commons. Another is practice gentle reciprocity. It's not a transactional even-steven affair. It's like, I'm giving and, in time I'll get back, and there has to be a certain reciprocity, but it's not a strict reciprocity. Another, for example, is preserve relationships in addressing conflicts. Every commons will have conflicts, but you don't want to have an exclusion of people or just banish them without going through a process of trying to come to terms and resolving them. So these are the kinds of things that the patterns address. And the takeaway point on all this is that comedy enacts different social logics. These are some of the different logics that are played out in a coherent, you might even say paradigmatic way in all sorts of different commons. Now, I've often wrestled with this. Can commons thrive and grow in the face of capitalist state system that's indifferent to hostile to it? After all, the state is far more interested in promoting economic growth and getting the tax revenue from it and the whole progress narrative than empowering a bunch of commoners who, are not contributing to the exchange economy, the market economy. And more broadly, state and commons have some really deep clashing priorities. The state likes centralized top-down control, fixed rules. It has a deep alliance with private capital, and it sees its legitimacy as coming through elections and representation. Whereas commoners want distributed bottom-up control that's locally specific with flexible situation-specific rules. They want to serve commoners' needs, not earn maximum money. And their legitimacy comes through their peer governance and collective stewardship. So there's some tensions going on between commons trying to work with the state, and now we've reached a whole different tier of things with the illiberal authoritarian state surging in many parts of the world. And it's unclear, can even liberalism maintain its grip on state power? I wrestled with this for a while because I found it profoundly depressing, but I came across this wonderful quote by Václav Havel, who was the cultural dissident and later the president of the Czech Republic. And in the 1970s, as a jailed dissident, he was asked, how do you deal with a totalizing system that's not amenable to rational persuasion or civic action? What do you do? And his answer was, you have to create a parallel polis, a horizontal space of relationships in which you can speak the truth, not censor and co-opt yourself, or let yourself be co-opted, in which you can develop a prefigurative order of the kind of society you want to have, and see how far you can go. And history smiled upon his experiment, and he later was able to actualize many of the ideals that he tried to develop as a parallel polis of dissidence. And I think that that's sort of how I see the commons verse needing to operate in the coming years, because I don't see it necessarily having an easy ride with the state that has other priorities and another worldview, usually. There's often important people inside of government, especially at city and town levels versus national and international, who are quite friendly and want to facilitate it. I have relationships with people in Amsterdam. There's a number of other European cities where there's good city officials and even elected officials of goodwill who want to be helpful and who are experimenting. I think Barcelona is probably the vanguard player in that regard. But one thing I've learned from some of these irregular experiments is that building the commons verse requires not only personal and social transformation, it requires new external structures. The personal transformation, you have to unlearn a lot of things of capitalist modernity. The individualism, and learn to see relationally and holistically. You need to take a longer term perspective. And you have to do this in a group. You can't just read a book or two and say, oh, I got it. You need to develop it with others. And then we need new external structures of law or social practice or sometimes technology to prevent enclosures, meaning the appropriation and privatization of shared wealth that we cherish. And critically, I think there's a need for new infrastructures to make commoning easier and more normal. So it's not this heroic historical accident, but something that people can say, oh yeah, I want to create that. And that there's a paradigm and a precedent and enabling resources. So I'd like to suggest some new infrastructures to empower commoning, which is my kind of notional wish list where I think things need to go. I think it needs to start with developing some translocal, besides individual commons themselves, start to get translocal federations of commoning, because we need to learn how to co-learn from each other and support each other and even be a political force for supporting commons. We already see this in digital spaces where there's international networks of Wikipedians and open source software programmers and open science scientists and open educational resource people, textbooks and curriculum. We need that type of federating support. Similarly, we need to experiment with commons public partnerships because the state has a lot to contribute if it can get its mind around delegating power and empowering people. There's a number of really worthwhile experiments to look at, but this is a work in progress. And it requires very special politicians or bureaucratic officials to help facilitate innovative ways of doing it. I think we need a lot of legal hacks because the Western law is so focused on the individual rights and contract freedom and property rights on an individual basis that is often hard to stand up for larger shared interests. The Creative Commons licenses are an example of a legal hack in which copyright law was hacked, so to speak, through a license, which made things shareable instead of immediately private. Similarly, we see rights of nature as a legal hack that a lot of indigenous people and other communities have evolved as a way to have legal personhood for mountains and rivers and other ecosystem elements so that they can be represented in courts. It's kind of an imperfect solution, but it begins to pull at the thread of conventional Western law for a broader perspective. And there are other types of hacks that people are experimenting with. This is important both to decriminalize commoning, because seed sharing or software code sharing is often illegal, and why should that necessarily be? But it's also needed to give clear legal authorization for types of commoning that may not have that. I've been involved with trying to develop the idea of relationalized finance, as I call it, which is we need to name a non-capitalist class of finance that is not dependent upon the extraction of investment or the extraction of lending, which in turn pressures commons to become productive, hierarchical, and in a sense, businesses, because they need to maximize the revenue to pay back investors and lenders, but instead maintain their autonomy and freedom and creativity by being able to pool money, or as I call it, transvestment of money from capitalist circuits of value into common stewardship of this alternative types of value. And it helps to realize that there are many examples of this already. They're just not put together as a coherent class of finance. Community land trust, community supported agriculture, community mutual credit systems and time banking, and so on down the road. There are many examples in which there is not the same extractive dimensions of conventional finance, but we don't call this a class of finance to which we should aspire, which I think we need to do if we're going to get out of the growth traps. 5, we need new institutions to support care. And I don't mean care as a unit of labor productivity, but care as a human engagement with people. I won't go through all of this except to say there are certain forms that are being experimented with for allowing people to express and manage care, to truly care for ecosystems, for each other, for shared community resources. You need supportive institutions for that, and that requires some innovation. And then finally, I think there's a need for a bioregional reorientation so that we can anchor life in the local landscape, decommodify shared wealth, nourish this ethic of cooperation, and elevate social goals over capital. Fortunately, there's a huge surge of bioregional activism right now around not only the US, but internationally. It's still in the very early stages, but it's very promising. I include these maps of so-called bioregional life mapping, because this is a map of the Great Sandy Desert in Australia as done by indigenous people. As you can see, it's kind of a work of art that expresses their affection and love and emotional connection to the landscape. And interestingly, this Manchester, England map that was done to life map their region has its own artistic dimensions that I found striking. I think this is partly what bioregionalism can help us do, is culturally manifest our love for the landscape and integrate it with the landscape, which is part of the stewardship. Now, I'm often asked, but can commons scale, and can they do it fast enough? After all, we've got climate change breathing down our neck. And I think the frank answer, maybe the too blunt answer, is scale is part of the problem. It's capturable, it's corruptible, and it has its own lumbering bluntness that doesn't tailor itself to local complexity. And so really, the lesson I've learned is that the next big thing will be a lot of small things. People ask, well, how do those small things get connected? The phrase that my co-author Silke and I came up with is emulate and federate. You keep the appropriate small scale so that you can have participation and accountability and connection to the local landscape or resources, but you federate among each other to have a larger impact over time and to hasten learning and proliferation. And I think that's really an important lesson for how commons can indeed scale, and arguably will do it faster than large governments or other centralized institutions that can act unilaterally perhaps, but can often be wrong, not be seen as legitimate, not be effective. And I found inspirational this quote from Ilya Prigogine, the Nobel laureate in chemistry. When a complex system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order. I think that's what we saw with Linux in the early days of open source software, where Microsoft was going nuts, saying, oh, this is communism, our business model, and so forth. But it shifted things dramatically. And I think that having, even though you give it a few percentages, 3%, 5%, 10%, it simply that it can be functionally productive in meeting needs outside of the existing system is both a moral indictment of the existing system as well as a demonstration that the alternatives can work. So let me just conclude by saying that I think that the Commons verse in its aggregate is about a politics of belonging, as George Monbiot has pointed out. It's about an economics of sufficiency as opposed to a utopian sense of relentless growth. And it's about a culture that decommodifies and shares, as we see in all sorts of existing functional commons. So with that, I want to thank you for coming, and I'd love to have a conversation about your questions and any other concerns you might have.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Scott Cooper, and I'm the minister here at Center Congregational Church, and I would like to welcome all of you here. I am hoping that our air conditioning units are adequately competing with the thermal BTUs that all of you are pumping out. It's been a very warm day, and I thank you for coming out on a warm day, but hopefully you're comfortable enough here. Perhaps we all do wish it was a bit cooler. Center Congregational Church was founded on the Commons in the year 18, and we froze to death. That was the year 1816, often referred to as 18, and we froze to death. And that is because in April 1815, a very large volcano in Indonesia exploded. And by 1816, it seriously disrupted the weather, particularly in the northern hemisphere. On June 7th and 8th, it snowed in Brattleboro. There was largely no summer, and crops failed, and it was a very difficult year. That was the year Center Church was founded on the Commons. If you go to the Commons right now, there's a rock and a plaque where the old church stood. And then in about 1847, it moved to a place called the Orchard here on what is now Main Street. So that is where all of you are. And before I take your questions, which by the way, I assume it's okay to just choose questions based on the highest bidder. So if you just wave a note in the air, I will look at the denomination and I will choose you if you're the highest bidder. No, I'm just kidding. But what I do want...
You had me going.
What I do want to say is that Center Congregational Church, by hosting Windham World Affairs Council, hopes to be, and continue to be, a bit of the Commons. If you are not already aware, the Muslim community worships here. A Hindu kirtan ministry worships here. A Buddhist, Zen Buddhist community worships here. And of course the Christians are still here. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a Hebrew Jewish kirtan service. So we really hope to be an interfaith commons of sort. And last but not least, as I'm sure many of you have seen, Center Church has been hosting many of the rallies. For example, the No Kings rally that just happened 2 weeks ago, hosted by Indivisible. And we hope to be a common site for democracy and free thought and assembly and association. So welcome all of you, and I am more than happy to hand you the microphone. I'll try to be as equitable as possible. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I will come to you. And I do ask that you use the microphone as I am, so that those, especially online, and those who will be watching the recorded version can hear your very good question. And unlike me, keep it brief.
If one should be fortunate enough to have resources to invest, and however ethically one chooses to invest those resources, putting it in the market just feels like I'm contributing to that commodification of value. And it's somewhat disquieting to me. And I'm not sure how to think about that.
I mean, in terms of investment in
Yes,
general?
yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I don't lose too much sleep over it because we're in a pervasive, ubiquitous capitalist culture, and security, our personal security often depends upon our investing. Having said that, I think there's a room for and a need for all sorts of forms of stability and security that don't come through our own personal good fortune or money-making capacities. And you know, a lot of European countries have developed this more, and a lot of so-called less developed countries have a lot of social systems of support that are not money-based that help deal with that. I think we're kind of in this poignant situation of having to participate in a capitalist economy and all of its pathologies in order to take care of our family or household needs.
Is there, though, alternative thinking around, alternative to the market?
Well, I don't think that much of it has historically come through state mutualization of services. Social Security is a good example, where the amount of, that's not investment in such a draconian way as a lot of conventional capitalist investments. But I think there's other ways that societies can provide security and safety for each other. We haven't developed them. I think we can learn a lot from the global South. There's a lot of, for example, the African diaspora has a lot of women's groups, women who pool their money and take care of each other. There's a sociologist at Toronto who wrote a book called The Black Banker Ladies, and it's about this tradition which predates capitalism as a kind of social security. I think, I'm sorry I don't have a more pat or expansive answer, but I think that's the direction we need to go.
Thank you. I'd like to see another thought. Have you thought about the possible interrelationship between this notion of transition town and the commons?
Well, transition town is obviously, it comes out of a different space than the commons, but I think it's utterly congruent, adjacent, supportive, fellow traveler in the same enterprise. It's trying to relocalize community stability and community economies. So I regard that as one of many adjacent movements, from cooperatives to the social and solidarity economy movement to the donut economics approach to try to put boundaries around our consumption. There's many, many others. I think that no one movement has all the answers. I think there's going to be a need for a lot of collaboration among these different movements coming out of different geographies and philosophical traditions.
But Brattleboro has a very active time trade, and I've been on the board at Time Trade. I've been a Time Trade member for like 15 years. I'm looking at Tony, who's sitting next to me, who's currently on the board. But kind of piggybacking on what Sky was saying, like how do we invest and how do we have investments? Like I have hundreds of hours. Maybe I don't have that much anymore. But I have a lot of hours in Time Bank that I can use, like if I need to have somebody help me in the garden, if I need to have someone pick up some groceries for me in town, if I need to have someone watch my dog while I'm gone. That's how the Time Bank works. We all wake up every day with 24 hours, so we're even. And we can use those 24 hours any way we want, and the Time Bank works where, let's say I edit someone's paper for them, because I do that a lot, and it takes me 2 hours. I just earn 2 hours of time that I can then go and trade to have someone take care of my dog for me while I'm away for the weekend. So, time trade, and here, I'll let Tony talk more.
Actually, I just want to say some things and then ask a question too, because it's related to sort of the socialization. There are, like Tamara's very involved, Beth there is very involved. I don't know if there are any of the other members here. Just the three of us. But I mean, the other thing is we also are involved in community service activities. Like I run the e-bike library. The town just cut all of its energy and climate change policies. I mean, almost everything. They cut everything. And we have an e-bike library because it's a time trade thing. There's no money. The town wasn't paying anything. It's just volunteers, and we worked with the library to do it. So that's been this, like, it would have been cut if it had been something that had been paid for. It would not exist anymore. And we do work with immigrants, the refugees who are at SIT. There's window dressers. There's a bunch of community service projects. We're like, oh, if you do this, you can get credit because you're helping the community. Related to what you're saying, issues of socialization, and we have a lot of members, but there's probably 40 who actually really utilize it. And a lot of people join it and say, oh, this is a great idea. It fits with my philosophy. I really want to do stuff outside of the market economy. And then people don't know how to engage with it. They don't know how to find the resource or use their resources to develop it. And I think that's one of the key things that we struggle with, and that I think are really important with all of the stuff that you're talking about.
I think that there's a lot of technical organizational issues that often, having a critical mass of diverse players in these alternative systems is often critical. The commons is not just magic pixie dust. It does require a lot of hard organizing and building on other successful models, but they're certainly worth the effort and can yield some great results that are not going to happen otherwise.
I just wanted to add that the Brattleboro timetrade.org was founded in 2010 as a result of two Antioch students' project, and it was their project. So therefore, there we are, and we've grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk, and now we really want to grow again. So if you're at all interested, you can see me or Tony or Tamara afterwards, and we can tell you all about it.
Thanks so much. What you're saying resonates so much with so many people in the room. I, as a child of the 60s and alternative lifestyles and alternative basic economies, I'm really intrigued about what you say about how scale is kind of the enemy, especially in this illiberal, authoritarian, fascist time that we're living in. I worry about, would over the next short-term period, would this end up being a small project for elites? Intellectual elites or lefty elites, like I consider myself, in that. How does this? I mean, to me, it seems like stories. I hope you and George put together more and more and more stories. Do a second follow-up to Invisible Doctrine or something, so that people's imagination can really take hold amongst all kinds of working class and ordinary people.
Well, let me see if I can address a number of the themes you raised. I think one reason that authoritarianism and fascism have appeal is because they create a sense of meaning and connection and belonging and community. And I think that that's singularly missing in much of our marketized culture. And so to the extent that commons can be a way that people can reconnect in authentic ways as opposed to manipulative social media ways or something algorithm-driven ways, it begins to rehumanize us, begins to get us out of ideological polarization, begins to give us shared purpose the way transition towns, despite whatever your political orientation was, can you hammer a nail? Can you do this? We want you. I think that kind of on-the-ground reconnection among people matters. And I think that a lot of the liberal enterprise hollowed that out in conjunction with the outsourcing of government and human connection. So I don't think it's a short-term fix. I do think it's a long-term contextual change that has to happen over time. The alternative is too scary to consider. And I don't know what the other philosophically or culturally animated projects there are that are going to do this. And I don't want to be an imperialist about the word commons either. There's a lot of people doing stuff that is like exemplary commoning that doesn't use the vocabularies. I do think the word commons and its concepts has strategic value in showing a kinship among different movements. The way in an early conference by my colleague, she brought seed sharers and software code sharers together, both of whom were being victimized by the enclosure of their shared wealth. And in some ways, the vocabulary of the commons helps name this kinship that we have in whatever our domain of activity is. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but I do think getting into the relational dimensions of commoning is a kind of redemption of sorts. It's been mine for the past 15, 20 years, because with some dismal times as neoliberalism has tightened the noose, and just finding other people who do amazing things, which I tried to depict, is encouraging, hopeful, and gives you some new vistas of possibility that if you just listen to the cable TV news or the political parties, you're not going to get.
Hi. Great speech, David. I'm just wondering, like, since the average age here is maybe 65 if we're lucky, I'm wondering what's being done to, like, reach out to the next generation with all this information. Are you a professor?
No.
Oh, you should be. But I'm thinking that, you know, like, how is this being taught to a younger generation, and how is it being exposed to them?
Well, that's, you know, if I had a pot of philanthropic money, I'd hire organizers who do outreach in education. It's not as if there are not young people involved in common. There's a lot of young farmers who are trying to get access to land through agrarian commons and other projects to try to become young farmers. There's a lot of tech people who actively manage either tech infrastructure or apps that they've developed as a commons. So and I could name many other realms where young people are involved. Whether they see the commons as a organizing discourse for themselves, who knows? You mentioned examples. At the table there, I have a prior book I did a few years ago called somebody could hold it up, called The Commoner's Catalog for Change Making, which is like a whole earth. Speaking of the 70s, it's like a whole earth catalog of commons examples, which you could, read quick. My mother, my friends could read without having to read a 200-page book, because they're just several paragraphs saying there's this common. And so that's a form of public education that I think people can access it more readily, and to simply register in the vocabulary and to make culturally legible what often exists but is invisible. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. At the same time, you say, are you a professor? At the same time, I think it's important to engage in a certain philosophically sophisticated conversation so that serious people can see that there is an alternative intellectual framework to consider, and that it's not just caring and sharing in some squishy way. It's got some depth to it, and there's lots of examples. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
This is a new concept to me, so I've been trying to make sense of this. And what's come up for me is more of a comment that the collective is greater than its parts. And Chuck, I'm reminded when you were doing work with the mobile park tenants who may have lost their property, and there was this collective effort. It wasn't, people gave what they could afford and helped each other out. And because that collective came together, look at the incredible power that created, building community. And then to further that story, Chuck, when you and your housemate lost your apartment to a fire, who showed up to help you out? I mean, just amazing to see how it's a vision beyond even my comprehension. These little parts and how much it can just take a life of its own.
And I would say that some of the commons I've witnessed, especially those that have been around for decades, resemble going into an old growth forest and its biodiversity, and it's like beautiful and sublime when you see some of these human collectives around certain purposes. And you mentioned a few moving examples. One of my most moving experiences was going to a village in India where that image up there of women, Indian women seed sharing, they were bonded laborers who couldn't make 3 meals a day because they couldn't afford it. But they reclaimed some land by fertilizing it with manure and so forth, reclaimed their mother's seeds, the native seeds, which had been displaced by the Green Revolution of Western pesticide type seeds that you had to use, and reclaimed land, and were able to have 2 meals a day, which was previously impossible. Anyways, seeing these women present their seeds, show that with great pride they had done this themselves, was a remarkable and moving experience for me. And I think that there's analogs of that in many different types of commons, especially survival commons, as opposed to discretionary commons. You know.
Just an example, talking about age and, is this elitist or not? My son, and then I have a question. My son and his wife live up in Addison County. Lots of farmers around there. He's a bare root tree nursery guy, and she works for NOFA. They have a community of about 12 different small farmers, if you will, within maybe a 25-mile radius. And their deal is that they take turns working on each other's enterprise, each other's property. And I heard this before I had the conversation with you. I heard this and I thought, wow, we just need so much more of that kind of community. In some cases, I belong to a theater group, I belong to a church, the commons is part of my everyday life. In some ways, it seems like we need to stop and name it and say, yes, this is good. I'm not on Amazon. I'm with a bunch of people making a play. Yes, this is good. Keep it going. My question was, when you and I spoke, one of the things that really struck me is that in Europe, doing these things, it's like, well, yeah, we're going to do this. Here, it's like you're called a commie or a socialist. Could you address that? And is there any way around that?
Well, I think, first of all, there are a lot of American traditions that are quite counter to that, from barn raising to quilting bees and so forth. So there is a tradition to be mined to validate and celebrate those collective types of actions. I do think that in this stage of American history, in this stage of media politics, it's hard not to slip down the rabbit hole of commercial, capitalist sensation, and to develop the kind of integrity of community that Vermont is kind of renowned for. I think Vermont is very special in that regard versus the rest of the country. I have found nourishment in Europe because they're not so freaked out by collectivist action politically or philosophically. And here we need to reclaim that. And in some ways, the US is the most behind relative to the rest of the world. I think the leaders of the global South, who, if anything, are trying to protect their historic ways of being, to recover their cultural memory that has been papered over in the past generation or two. So they have a different challenge than us, which is trying to escape and reinvent collective traditions of mutual care and support. So that's our dilemma. I mean, I'm an American, but I've had to be educated by Europeans and global South people.
So we're coming into, a group of people, like the younger baby boomers, like myself, coming into like aging in place. And, we, as a teacher, I can't necessarily afford what my parents could afford, which was to buy into a progressive community care community. And so I'm thinking about, okay, we need a commons for people aging in place, and how do we do it? And that's a big deal. It's a big question.
You name a great topic. As I said earlier, commons can happen anywhere, and that's one right for it. I'm sure there's a lot of lessons to be learned from previous experiments to make them work socially and financially. But I think it's probably going to be more affordable and more humane care than you get from a for-profit retirement facility. But we haven't really seriously explored or developed many of these alternatives.
We have time for perhaps 2 more questions.
Here in Vermont, Murray Bookchin, who's an anarchist, started the Institute for Social Ecology, and I was just wondering if there are at least ideological similarities between the Commons and the Institute.
Yes. He was very much into bottom-up autonomy and self-determination. He was very big into municipalism. So I can't say I'm a deep scholar of Murray Bookchin, but he's certainly supportive in general, and I'm sure he would see the Commons as a positive manifestation of what he was trying to develop. I mean, I think part of the problem is, one pivot point is whether you're focused chiefly on reforming state and political parties to achieve things. I see the Commons has a distinct advantage. You can do this right now, in most cases, without having permission or money from the state, without having to go through a legislature or a court, except in rare cases when you're maybe going up to the line. The point is, we can do this. And I think that Murray Bookchin was of a similar attitude, but also trying to deconstruct the state and rethink the state, which I think is the end game that has to happen. The state needs to function in different ways than it does right now, and how are we going to do that? Is it going to be through parties? I happen to think that it's going to be developing the parallel polis that at some point says to the state, you're ineffective, you're distrusted, you're not meeting needs. We commoners might want to strike a deal with you. You can support us, and we can help to do a lot of things that the state's incapable of doing. This is kind of an open discussion that maybe Murray Bookchin helped spark that we need to expand.
One last question.
Thank you. I really appreciate the discussion about how this all may take shape, how this all may progress. But I want to share just what is happening with everyday folks right now. My son and his 20-year-old friends, I don't think there's a college education in the whole pack of them. But they make sure they take care of each other, their respective families, their children. I see it actively. They are engaged. They are invested. They have provided for me on a couple occasions, and my money's no good. We got you. I know they take care of some elderly needs that money would buy, but that person, don't worry about it. We got you. I'd like folks to be really opening our eyes and our thinking that, in fact, this may be around us in southern Vermont in a real low-key way. Maybe the polis will rise and politics makes sense to these folks. Right now, nothing makes sense other than making sure so-and-so's kid has the clothes they need for starting school next year. And yeah, I think it's really key for us to be open to your everyday person, your everyday young or not young person who is living this now genuinely.
I absolutely agree with that. I would only add, I think we need to institutionally amplify and support that so that it can be more visible and not just irregular one-off taking care of people, which is obviously important. But 1,000 points of light of volunteerism is not going to be the same as something that has some modest institutional presence as a commons. In other words, some continuity, some modest resources of support, or in the best cases, infrastructures that make it easier to do that. But you're absolutely right. That sentiment, that way of being needs to be nourished, and we need to take that further.
Okay. I did hear that there perhaps might be opportunities to talk with folks informally regarding the timeshare. Our speaker also will be able to chat with you. May I please remind you before you go that the resources, the books are here on the table, and they can be purchased, I assume.
Everyone's books.
By everyone's books. So please support the cause and the books and everyone's books. Have a very safe drive or walk or bike home. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you.